I'm going to read today from Charlotte Stein's Doubled, which is one of my favorite Charlotte Stein books. And this is a Menage book, so it's about a college student who falls for twin brothers who are identical. And in this scene, they've been messing around, and then she hasn't talked to them for days. And they call her over to the apartment where they live to pick up this book that she left there, supposedly, because they're best friends. But there's a third person in the apartment, and she doesn't know what to do about him. He's this sort of sleazy guy who has a blog where he writes about like embarrassing or horrible things that students at their college do. So she's like frozen in terror, which is my favorite state for Charlotte Stein's heroines to be in because they're so hilariously funny. So that's what's going on here. She's just come into the apartment, and the brothers are offering her a piece of cake, which they've baked. And she doesn't want to be there at all. She wants to leave, but she's going to eat the cake anyway. Here you go, Tobias said, and handed her the slice of cake he'd just brought from the kitchen. Innocent enough, really, but a similar thing happened when his fingers touched hers and their eyes met. Her insides finished turning to liquid and slid right out of her body to form a puddle on the floor. She had no clue how she was going to eat what he'd given her without a stomach, and especially with a slice that big. It looked like a doorstop on her plate, and she had an idea his cake carving had been deliberate. She'd have to sit here and polish the whole thing off, after all. By the time she'd succeeded in 100 years' time, Christian would be gone, and then it would be just them. So, Christian, didn't you say you had to be somewhere? Sebastian asked, as she did her best to get the slice of cake into her mouth. It wasn't easy, however, for some probably equally devious reason. Tobias hadn't given her a fork, and they'd smeared the whole thing with so much frosting she wasn't even sure if anything actually baked existed in there. Her fingers sank into the hilt, most of it going around her mouth as she tried to seem like a casual cake eater. She really didn't need Tobias's incredulous stare to know that she wasn't succeeding, however. You okay, Bobby? He asked, but she couldn't get the clog of cake in her throat down fast enough to answer properly. Instead, the following choked out of her. I don't think that's a word, Sebastian said, and though it stung a little, she had to agree. Somehow she'd started failing on all levels: ability to use words, eating like a normal person, controlling of libido. Tobias didn't seem to appreciate his twin's attitude, however. She saw him snap his fingers and give the sharpest look before she followed the direction both actions were aimed at, to Sebastian, who did not seem happy. He rolled his eyes, blew out a breath. If this went on any longer, he was definitely going to hurl Christian out of a window with the help of a machine gun, and maybe he'd catch her in the crossfire just for good measure. Seriously, Christian, we have a lot of things to do, he said, at which point anyone else would have taken the hint, but not weird, insular, suit-wearing Christian Carter. He even had the leather patches on his elbows as though he'd hit 45 before his 22nd birthday. She watched him run a hand through a thick hank of dirty blonde hair, the one that somehow looked like a comb-over, even though he wasn't balding at all. I'll be finished momentarily, he said, but she suspected he didn't actually know what that word meant. He just carried right on, sifting and marking things with his little red pen for what seemed like forever. She even managed to finish the cake, and then didn't know what to do with herself. Would it piss Sebastian off even further if she just said she had to go? You want to come and get your book, Bobby? Or maybe he actually wanted her out of there. It certainly felt like it as she followed him into his bedroom, everything so solemn and slow and sort of like a funeral procession. She could feel her heart sinking into her guts as she crossed the threshold, because seriously, what was going to happen now? The conversation out there had been awkward enough. In this dark room with just Sebastian and his crossed arms and his mean upper lip, she wasn't sure what to say. I didn't mean to not answer your calls for 3 days. Can we just never talk about this thing? Both seemed inadequate, so she just stood in the middle of the room instead, hands laced tightly together, one shoe scuffing over the back of the other. God, she wished she hadn't worn a skirt and moderate heels. Did it seem too showy like this? Like she'd made an effort in the hopes that things would... I'm sorry, he said, so sudden and so breathless that she thought she'd misheard. He had the book held out, as if that were the thing he was talking about, though obviously it couldn't have been the case. He meant the other stuff. He was sorry about the other stuff. And he looked so anxious, too, so not like himself. It tore her apart. It turned everything upside down. All of her expectations of this, and her worries and doubts. Why had she thought he was angry with her? Clearly he was angry with himself for doing something so impulsive and less driven, and oh God, something was happening inside her. She could feel it rising up, taking sense with it as it went, and by the time it got to her head, she'd forgotten Christian Carter ever existed. She just had to reach for him, now. Grab something on him, like his big arms or his big shoulders, or hell, his big thighs would do. She could see them outlined against the barely there material of the robe, all long and muscular, good, and the sight just made her foolish. Everything on him made her foolish. His lips were parted, his eyes were wide and almost black in the darkened bedroom, and the moment she reached out one tentative sort of hand to just touch something on him, anything at all, really, he didn't move away. He didn't even try to stop her when she gathered a handful of that threadbare material into her fist. Of course, that might have been because she did it somewhere innocent, like his elbow, but she couldn't deny that look on his face either. That hungry, desperate sort of look. The one that made her realize he wasn't sorry at all. He just wanted her to keep pulling and pulling at him until suddenly her mouth was on his and her other hand was in his hair, and oh God, she had absolutely no control over herself. She couldn't be angry about that fact, however. He tasted like peppermint, all clean and hot and sharp on her tongue, and after a moment of crushing his lips with hers, he did something that set every alarm bell in her body going. He slipped one big hand around her waist, as sure and steady as she was not, and yanked her body flush against his. So, that's doubled from Charlotte Stein.